Hello there. Welcome to this opportunity to study the Bible with me, Mark Thomas. I'm the minister at Mount Pleasant Baptist Church in Blackwood. So I'm going to be looking at the book of Colossians in the New Testament, and I'm glad that you were able to join with me. Regard this as something like a book club, a Bible book club, where we focus on one particular Bible book and work our way through it to glean its truths, to understand its purpose and meaning, and to apply that to our lives. So thanks very much for joining me on this session 1 of Colossians. Why Colossians? Well, Colossians is the most wonderful of books in the Bible. It's so encouraging, so positive in the way in which it affirms our calling, our faith in Jesus. And also, it's the most glorious book in what it talks of Jesus, the way in which it presents him, explains who he is and what he's done for us. So, all in all, this is the most wonderful book to read and to study. And I would encourage you to read the whole book. It's only a couple of pages. It won't take you very long. I would really encourage you to read the whole thing in one sitting to get a feel and a flavour for what it's about. Then perhaps you would choose to maybe summarize what you've read and think about, well, what does that say in one or two sentences? I have a particular sentence or line, a one-liner, if you like, to summarize this whole book, and it would be this. Paul encourages the Colossian Christians to see Jesus as the center of all reality, so that they don't give in to pressure from other cultural and religious ideas and philosophies. So that's a simple summary of the whole book. And I'd encourage you, as I say, to read and come up with your own summary. And then perhaps choose to memorize a part of it. There's something very uplifting when you can get it right into your mind, into your being, into your soul, some of the truths of these words. And if you're going to choose a particular section of Colossians to memorize, well, why don't you hone in on verses 15 to 20 of chapter 1, and you would be truly blessed to have that inside you. Anyway, Paul's letter to the Colossians. It was written during Paul's many imprisonments, one of his many imprisonments for announcing Jesus as the risen Lord. And arguably, this one was written from his imprisonment in Ephesus, which was about 100 miles to the west of Colossae in modern-day Turkey. And it was probably written around AD 55, 56 during his third missionary journey, which you can read about in Acts chapter 19. And the letter is addressed to a group of Christians who Paul had never met, who made up this church community in Colossae. Colossae was inland, not far from another town you may have heard of called Laodicea. That gets a reference in Revelations chapter 2. And Colossae, which is a place in the world, as I say, in modern-day Turkey, which is still yet to be fully excavated. And so there are yet many truths, I think, to discover about that particular place. However, the church in Colossae was started by a co-worker of Paul named Epaphras, who was actually from that city. Verse 7 of chapter 1 and especially verse 12 of chapter 4 seem to very strongly indicate that. Chapter 4 verse 12 says, Epaphras, who is one of you. Speaking to the Colossians, implying that he was a Colossian, or at least from Colossae. And Epaphras had recently visited Paul in prison, where he updated him on how well the Colossians were doing. But he also mentioned some of the cultural pressures that tempted those Colossians to turn away from Jesus. So there's a sense in which Paul hears that they are awesome, and yet they are under pressure. And so in a sense, what he writes to them is that he tells them, they are awesome, but I know that you are under pressure. And so let's see if we can deal with some of those things for you. So Paul writes this letter to encourage the Colossians to address the issues that Epaphras had raised and then challenge them to a greater devotion to Jesus. to the one and to come to terms with what it really means to be a follower of Jesus as Lord. Well, we've said that he writes from prison, and in this letter, similarly in letters like Ephesians and Philippians, one of the things that he wants to say is something about how different being a believer, being a follower of Jesus, makes to his own life. There's a sense in which in this letter, he wants them not to worry about the fact that he's in prison. In fact, he acknowledges, and we'll come to it when we study this section, he acknowledges that being in prison is actually serving Jesus. It's serving the good news of Jesus. It's serving the gospel and its promotion around the world. It helps to advance the message of Jesus, and we'll hear more of that later. So Paul is writing to them to encourage them, to strengthen their faith, and particularly to tell them that although there are many philosophies, worldviews, ways of seeing the world, received wisdom perhaps, there is yet one true wisdom, and it's found in Jesus. And we'll discover that as we work our way through the text. I wanted to give you a very brief summary structure of how the book is put together, and then we'll do a very brief sweeping summary of the text. So let me see if I can share my screen for a moment and allow you to see the simplest of outline structures of this book. It's split into 4 sections primarily, and when my PowerPoint catches up with us, we'll see that there are 4 chunks, and the first chunk is primarily about Jesus. The second, primarily Paul talks about himself. Then thirdly, he talks to the Colossians, recognizing their situation and growing in a relationship and understanding them. And thirdly, what it is to live as a Christian. So our emphasis is on the first section with Jesus, the exalted Messiah. Then it will be about Paul, the suffering apostle. Then the Christians who are under pressure, and then what it is to live in the light of Jesus being Lord. Okay, so that's a simple outline structure for you to bear in mind. And we're going to do a very sweeping summary of the whole book. So you need the book in front of you, and I won't be referring to any finer detail, but a full sweep of the whole book. And it goes like this. Paul first thanks God that he had learned from Epaphras that the Colossians have been faithful to Jesus. This is in verses 3 to 5 of chapter 1. They've been showing God's love, or their love for God and their neighbor, all because of the hope that they have in the new creation that Jesus has in store. Then Paul moves on to pray that they will grow in their wisdom and understanding about Jesus. That's in verses 9 and 10. Then Paul has placed a poem here to help the Colossians and us to do just that, grow in our knowledge and wisdom and understanding of Jesus. The poem is in verses 15 to 20, and it is a real gem, a jewel, the highlight of this book. It's the centerpiece of chapter 1 for sure, a poem all about the crucified and exalted Messiah. It has 2 parallel stanzas, and it's crammed with language and imagery from the book of Genesis and Exodus, and from the Psalms and Proverbs. The first section is in verses 15 to 16, and Paul there explores how Jesus is the true image of God. In him, the full character and purpose of God is embodied in a human. And this human, Jesus, the Son, is the firstborn, it says in verse 15, which is an Old Testament phrase about Jesus's royal status above all creation. He shares in the very identity of the one true creator God, verse 16. And by him, all reality, all powers and authorities, spiritual and human, have been created. It's in Jesus the Messiah that we discover the very author of all things. And in the second stanza of this poem, verses 18 to 20, we also discover that he is the one who is bringing about a new creation. He is the head of a new body, which refers to Jesus's church. They are the new humanity, of which he and his own resurrection existence is the prototype and foretaste. He is the firstborn, as it says. And in him, God's glorious presence dwells. And so it's through Jesus' death and resurrection that God has reconciled himself to humanity, to all spiritual powers, indeed, to all of creation. You see, it's a remarkable poem, and Paul will keep referring back to it as he goes on in the letter. Then we move on to chapter 1, verses 24 to chapter 2, verse 5, which is the second big chunky section about Paul, the suffering apostle. So he first shows how the truth of this poem transforms his own experience of suffering in prison. He's being imprisoned, he's being punished for announcing to both the Greek and Roman world that Jesus is the resurrected Lord and King of all. And so his suffering, he thinks, is not a sign of defeat, but is the way of participating in Jesus' own sufferings, done in an act of love. His hardship is not a cause of joy. He is no masochist. He is in prison for the surprising news that Israel's resurrected Messiah is creating a new multi-ethnic family. His hardships are real, but they can bring joy to him because of what is being achieved through it. And more, just as the divine glory dwells in Jesus, so Jesus dwells in and amongst his international family, or as Paul describes it, that which is Christ in you all, the hope of glory. Chapter 1, verse 27. Christ in you all, the hope of glory. Then the third chunky section of this book starts at chapter 2, verse 6 through to 23, and it's addressed to the Christians who he acknowledges are under pressure to turn away from Jesus. So Paul then addresses the cultural pressures that are tempting the Colossians to turn away from Jesus. And there are two influences to resist. They were confronted by a combination of mythical polytheism along with the pressure to observe the laws of the Torah. I will explain more as we encounter them in the text. But in simple terms, these new Christians in Colossae, they had grown up worshipping the various Greek and Roman gods who govern different areas and parts of human life. And many just included Jesus as one more god to worship, just added him on to Hermes and Aphrodite and Apollo. There was also great pressure from the Jewish community for these non-Jewish Christians to supposedly complete their commitment to the Messiah by following the various laws of the Torah in the Old Testament. Specifically, Paul mentions eating a kosher diet or observing sacred days or submitting to circumcision. It's very similar to the problem that Paul addressed in his letter to the Galatians. For Paul, to give in to either of these temptations to compromise was regarded as a failure to grasp who Jesus really is and what he has achieved on our behalf. You see, the Colossians used to live in fear of spiritual powers and elemental spirits, as Paul calls them in chapter 2, verse 20. But Jesus has triumphed over these. Check out chapter 2, verse 15. Jesus has triumphed over all spiritual beings and elemental spirits and all sorts of other real and imagined powers through his death and resurrection. He has freed the Colossians from any obligation to them. Jesus sets people free. In the same way, Jesus fulfilled on our behalf for the laws of the Torah, which never had the power to transform the selfish human heart anyway, any more than the resolutions that we come up with at the beginning of a new year actually ever really change us. And so what Jesus did in his life and death and resurrection, they lack nothing in what they're able to achieve. They don't need to be supplemented by following a whole set of Old Testament laws, because Jesus really is the fulfillment of those laws, the very thing in which those laws pointed towards. Indeed, followers of Jesus have the power of his resurrection in their lives to change them, which is what he goes on to talk about in chapters 3 and 4. Chapters 3 and 4 are the fourth big chunky section of this letter, and they talk about the resurrection life. So following Jesus means joining his new humanity. That's what chapters 3 verses 1 to 7 talk about. Joining Jesus's new humanity, because now our lives have been joined to the risen Jesus. That's why Paul challenges the Colossians in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 3 to set your minds on things above, where the Messiah is seated or rules at God's right hand. Paul doesn't here mean think about how one day we'll leave earth and go to heaven. No, rather, Paul here is talking about heaven as the transcendent place where Jesus now rules over all creation, and from where one day he will return here to transform all things. Or, as Paul puts it in verse 4 of chapter 3, when Christ, who is your life, appears, or is revealed, you also will appear with him in glory. So, Paul challenges them to live in the present as the kind of new humans that they will one day become. He uses the image of their old humanity, characterized by distorted sexuality and destructive speech. For Christians, that humanity died with Jesus and has been replaced with his own new humanity, which is characterized by mercy and generosity and forgiveness and love. And this new humanity, this new being, it transcends the ethnic and social boundary lines of a world where class divides. In Paul's words, it has created a new place where there is no Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, slave or free, but the Messiah is all and in all. So Jesus is Lord of the house, we might say, and that's perhaps how you could summarize chapter 3 verses 18 to chapter 4 verses 1. Jesus is Lord of the house. This is where Paul gets really practical, and he even shows the Colossians what this new humanity is going to look like in a first century Roman household, which actually was a highly authoritarian institution where the male patriarch held the power of life and death over his wife and children and slaves. And Paul says that is not to be the case in a Christian household. For here it's the risen Jesus who is Lord. And so in him, the wife allows her husband to become responsible for her. And the husband is subject to loving his wife and placing her well-being above his very own. And in a home where Jesus is Lord, children are not objects, but are called to a maturity and to respect their parents. And the parents are to raise their children with patience and understanding. Christians, when they had slaves, were to honor them. And the slaves or to honor their human masters, precisely because the real master is Jesus. And Christians who have slaves are to understand that this slave is not their property, but rather is a fellow member of Jesus's body, to be honored and embraced in love. Paul is walking a very fine line here. He is reshaping the most basic Roman institution around Jesus, who rules by his self-giving love. And so, while Paul doesn't abolish the household structure overnight, the exalted Christ demands that it be transformed almost beyond recognition of any Roman living in Colossae could have imagined. You can see this most clearly in the letter's conclusion, which is in chapter 4, verses 2 to the end. After a request for prayer, Paul applies these life-changing, institutional changing instructions about Christian slaves and masters, and we discover that Tychicus is the one carrying and reading this letter to the Colossians, and he's accompanied by a certain Onesimus, who was a former slave to a Colossian Christian named Philemon. And we discover from another letter addressed to Philemon that Onesimus had escaped from his master. It was a crime worthy of punishment. But Paul asks the whole church to greet Onesimus as a faithful and loved brother in the Lord. And their response would probably be, "You are joking. You're kidding. There's no way that that's going to happen. That can't be right." And then in the letter to Philemon, Paul says that he should receive Onesimus no longer as a slave, but as a brother. Talk about ending his letter with a punch. This is life-changing stuff. And so in the letter to the Colossians, Paul is inviting all of us to see not part of our lives, but our very being and all that is structured around our lives and affects our lives should not remain untouched by the loving and liberating rule of the risen Jesus. Our suffering, our temptations to compromise, our moral character, the power dynamics and relationships in our homes, in our families, in our churches, in our communities, all of it must be re-examined and transformed by Jesus. We are invited to live in the present as if the new creation really has already arrived when Jesus rose from the dead. And that is what the book of Colossians is all about. So go and read it again for yourselves, the whole thing in one sweep, and sense the wonder and amazement, the joy and the challenge of this transforming news. And I'll see you again next time when we get into the detail, we get down to the text, we read the passages, and we rejoice in the truths that we discover. So do hope that you'll join me again for our next session as we study the book of Colossians. In the meantime, do take care, stay safe, and God bless.